Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing how to write clean JavaScript code. And what we mean by clean code is simply code that is easy to understand, it's easy to update, and it's easy to maintain. Moreover, we want to focus on idiomatic code, meaning code that follows the standard practices of the language. Now, the first way that we can accomplish this is by using modern JavaScript syntax. We had an entire video on this modern syntax in the crash course, and I would really focus on trying to incorporate that syntax into your JavaScript code. A lot of times when you learn a new language like JavaScript, you might think of the solution to your problems in another language and then translate it over to JavaScript. However, you need to start thinking in JavaScript. What is the most idiomatic way to write that code that you want to write in the JavaScript language? A few of the more important pieces of this modern syntax to focus on will first of all be arrow functions. Now, of course, you can't use arrow functions everywhere, and I wouldn't recommend that, but you should be using arrow functions for small inline functions that don't rely on creating a new this context. Additionally, you should be using destructuring syntax. In JavaScript, we tend to work with a lot of objects, and destructuring can simplify the code a ton. And then I would also make sure to use template literals. Essentially, anytime you need to concatenate a string with some other value, I would almost always use a template literal, as it is going to make the code much easier to read, and it is the more common practice with modern JavaScript. Next, I would try to avoid overly nesting callback functions. And what I mean by this is having a function that takes in a callback function as a parameter, and then that function that gets passed in as a parameter also takes in a callback function, and so on and so forth. With each level of nesting, for one, these functions just become much harder to follow, but they also become more and more dependent on each other. In general, we want to be making functions that are reusable, whereas a function that depends on being a callback function to another function that also needs to be a callback function to some other function is not independent and can only be used in one context. A great way to do this is by using promises, and specifically I would recommend using the async and await keywords. By doing this, we can prevent having too many nested callback functions, and our code can be read in a way that looks much more synchronous and obvious as to what it's going to do. Next, we want to avoid overusing the this keyword. Now, this doesn't mean that we can never use the this keyword, and there are many times when we should use it. However, we want to avoid abusing the keyword. And what I mean by that is that we shouldn't be using the this keyword as like an extra parameter. We shouldn't be binding values to this that don't necessarily make sense as a this value. Additionally, there are times when it just makes a lot more sense to give a function a parameter than it does to make it dependent on the context with which it is being called. The next point I want to talk about is something that can feel a little bit different for somebody that is coming from another language that might be a more object-oriented language such as Java. And what that is that we should be utilizing functional programming as much as possible. Now, we have talked about how JavaScript is a multi-paradigm language, and of course, the object-oriented nature of JavaScript is important, and we should utilize it at the right times. However, most of the time, we want to be using JavaScript as a functional language. This means writing pure functions which can help keep our code consistent. This means that the functions will have no side effects, and they should produce the same output for any given input. Additionally, we want to be utilizing function chaining, as this can give our code a much more declarative feel that can make it much easier to read than the imperative alternatives. And moreover, using these functional programming principles in JavaScript is just the more standard way to do things, and it is going to make your code more consistent with other code out there in the industry. Up next, I would recommend to use a code auto formatter. What this is a plugin that you can add to your code editor, and it is going to automatically format your code. The most common one of these is going to be Prettier. So what Prettier does is when you save your code, or you can just run it at any given time, you can have Prettier automatically indent your code and just make it look a lot cleaner. Additionally, this allows you to create consistency. So if all of the contributors to your project are using the same auto formatter, then everybody will have the same styled code with the same size spaces and tabs, the same max character length, and so on and so forth. So to show how Prettier works, we can actually come over to the browser and we can go to prettier.io, which is their website, and we can play with the different settings and see what it's going to do. So for example, here on the left-hand side, I can type in some code. So let's start with an add function. So I can say function add, and this is going to take in a parameter x and y, and then it is simply going to return x plus y. Now the code I've written looks fine, and you can see the output is the exact same. But what we can do is sort of mess up this code a little bit so it's less clean code, and Prettier is going to fix it for us. So for example, if I leave off the semicolon, you can see the output still has a semicolon. Moreover, if I was to remove the space between the parameters, the output will still have the space. Additionally, if I added a bunch of spaces, we still just get one space in the output, which obviously looks cleaner. We could also maybe put the entire function onto one line. So let's move this up here like this, and just do it all in one line. And you can see pretty much no matter what we do with the white space, Prettier is keeping this function nice and clean and easy to read. And if we go ahead and return this to new lines like this, then what we can also look at is how Prettier is going to deal with strings. So maybe we return the string of the number 1 plus the string of px, so 1 pixel. But you can see we used single quotes and double quotes, whereas Prettier is using just double quotes. So it is transforming our code to be more consistent. And then if we looked on the left-hand side here, we actually have some changes that we can make to what the output is going to look like. So for example, we could change this to use single quotes instead of double quotes. And now you can see we have single quotes, not double quotes. We could also maybe say that we don't want semicolons and it will remove the semicolon instead of adding a semicolon. We can also change the size of tabs. So for example, if we wanted 4 space tabs, it would move all of the indenting over. We can also set a different max length. So if we made this very small, so say the max length is just 10 characters, then you can see it's going to a bunch of new lines to accommodate this. Of course, we wouldn't want a max length this low, but it is just to show what Prettier would end up doing. And that's really all there is to Prettier. It's very simple, and you can install this in almost any code editor, and you can add a config file to your project that will make sure that all of the contributors are using the same settings within Prettier. And finally, the last point I want to make about writing clean JavaScript code is going to be related to using a style guide. The concept of style guides aren't specific to JavaScript. They are simply documents that describe what style you should write your code in. Now, the goal of these guides is not necessarily to be correct. There are times when there are multiple ways to write the same code. But instead, the goal is to encourage consistency. So while 2 style guides might have conflicting rules, what is important is just to pick a singular guide and follow it. And this can mean using a popular open source one and maybe making some changes for your own project, or even writing one completely from scratch. Although I wouldn't necessarily recommend taking the time to do that unless you're working on a very large project with a ton of contributors. Otherwise, I would recommend just using one of the open source ones. And as an example of that, let's take a look at the Google JavaScript Style Guide. So this here is the Google JavaScript Style Guide, and it is available on the Google GitHub page, and they also have a variety of other style guides for other languages, including TypeScript, and some other languages and frameworks that you might use on the front end. Now, we aren't going to go through everything in this style guide, but if you do choose to use it, I do recommend actually reading all of it. It doesn't actually take that long to go through, as most of it is things that you would expect and you can get through very quickly. But we can quickly, even just looking at the table of contents, get an idea of some of their rules. So for example, under formatting, we can see that they use 2 space tabs and they have a column limit of 80 characters. And again, while I do recommend giving the style guide you are using a quick read, while you are working, you can always look things up to see what the rules are. So for example, if I wasn't sure if I should be using const, let, or var, I could come down to language features, and I see local variable declarations, So we could click on this, and here we see it says declare all local variables with either const or let, use const by default, unless a variable needs to be reassigned, which in that case we would be using let, of course, and the var keyword should never be used. Additionally, here we could see some other rules related to local variable declarations. So for example, they say to only use one variable per declaration, so we should not do all of this on one line according to their style guide. But again, one of the key points with these style guides is not to say that this is objectively correct and that having two variables in one declaration is necessarily wrong. What it is to say is that this is how Google has chosen to write their JavaScript code, which allows them to have consistent code, and most likely they have made that decision for a good reason. But if you have a different good reason to do something else, you can do that in your own projects, of course, and you might want to have a fork of the style guide or use a specific prettier config to enforce those rules that you have changed. Okay, so with that, that's going to be the end of this video on writing clean JavaScript code. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something new. I'll see you in the next one.